In 216 BC, under the blazing sun of Cannae, Rome suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Hannibal, the brilliant Carthaginian general, executed a maneuver so devastating that it remains one of the greatest tactical masterstrokes ever recorded. With superior strategy and ruthless precision, he encircled and annihilated over 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single day. For most nations, a defeat like this would have meant collapse, surrender, maybe even total destruction. But Rome was different. They didn't break. They didn't retreat into history. They adapted. They rebuilt. And they came back stronger. Just 14 years later, the very army that had been decimated at Cannae marched into Carthage itself. They crushed Hannibal's forces. They burned his city to the ground. What should have been the end of Rome became the beginning of its domination. How did they do it? How did a military force that suffered one of the worst defeats in history transform itself into the most unstoppable war machine the ancient world had ever seen? The answer lies in how they recruited and trained their soldiers. A Roman soldier wasn't just a man with a sword. He was a machine, forged through discipline, honed by relentless training, and built for endurance beyond limits. Unlike many armies of the time, where men were hastily gathered from farms and towns, the Roman legions took only the best. Recruitment was brutal. Only the strongest, most resilient men were chosen, and once selected, they were thrown into a grueling, relentless training regimen designed to break the weak and forge the elite. To even be considered, a recruit had to meet strict physical standards: height, muscle mass, stamina, all carefully evaluated. Farmers and laborers were preferred over city dwellers. Why? Because they were already accustomed to hard work, exhaustion, and pain. But raw strength meant nothing without discipline. Training was merciless. March 30 kilometers in under 5 hours, carrying 60 pounds of gear. If you fell behind, you were punished immediately. There were no exceptions. A Roman soldier had to be relentless. Practice with training weapons, twice as heavy as real ones. A wooden gladius built strength and precision, so that in real combat, the actual weapon would feel like an extension of his arm. No wild slashes, only stabs. Slashing was inefficient. A thrust to the gut was quick and deadly, while an uncontrolled swing left a soldier vulnerable to counterattack. This wasn't just about building warriors. It was about forging men who could march for days, fight for hours, and never break formation. But even the strongest fighters couldn't win wars alone. What made the Roman legions truly unstoppable wasn't just their strength. It was their tactics. The Romans didn't just fight well. They fought smart. While other armies relied on sheer numbers or brute strength, the Roman legions moved like a living, breathing organism. They weren't rigid. They weren't static. They could adjust, adapt, and overwhelm any enemy on any battlefield. At the heart of their battlefield dominance was the Triplex Acies, the famous three-line formation designed for maximum endurance in long battles. This system allowed the Romans to rotate fresh troops into combat, while their exhausted enemies struggled to keep up. Hastati, frontline fighters, young, aggressive. Often just teenagers, they formed the first wave of attack. Their job? Soak up the initial impact, disrupt enemy formations, and then fall back through gaps in their own ranks before exhaustion set in. Principes, main attack force. The seasoned warriors in their late 20s or 30s. Stronger, smarter, deadlier. These were the men who had already survived years of war. Once the Hastati fell back, the Principes stepped forward with renewed energy and unbroken discipline. Triarii, final defense, and elite veterans. These were the best of the best. Men who had fought for decades. Unlike the first two lines, they wielded long spears instead of short swords, making them a wall of steel in defense. They were Rome's last line of hope. If the Triarii were forced to fight, it meant the battle was on the brink of disaster. In fact, the Romans had a saying, "Res ad Triarios venit," it has come down to the Triarii. This layered formation gave the Romans an unmatched advantage. While other armies threw everything into one fighting force, the Romans fought in waves, keeping their men fresh while the enemy gasped for air. And that's why, at Cynocephaly in 197 BC, the undefeated Macedonian phalanx was ripped to pieces. The Macedonians relied on one thing, a wall of spears, marching forward in lockstep formation. It had dominated battlefields for centuries. It was nearly unstoppable. But the Romans didn't play by their rules. They didn't charge head-on into the spears. They waited for gaps to open, then slipped through, flanked the enemy, and tore them apart from the inside. By the time the Macedonians realized what was happening, it was too late. Their formation collapsed. Their army was destroyed. The enemy was rigid. The Romans were fluid. That's why they won. But tactics alone don't win wars. The Romans needed weapons that could turn their formations into an unstoppable force. Roman weapons, built for dominance. The Roman war machine wasn't just built on strategy, it was powered by precision-engineered weapons that made their legions nearly unstoppable. Every Roman soldier carried an arsenal designed for maximum efficiency, ensuring they were deadly at any range. Gladius, the perfect killing sword. The gladius wasn't just a sword. It was a death machine in the hands of a Roman soldier. Unlike the long, heavy swords used by barbarian warriors, which relied on wild, swinging attacks, the gladius was made for precision. Short, sharp, deadly. It was designed for stabbing, not slashing. Why? Because a single thrust through the gaps in enemy armor or into the abdomen could drop an opponent instantly. And, in the tight formation of a Roman shield wall, there was no room for wide, reckless swings. A soldier needed to strike quickly, kill efficiently, and move on to the next enemy, without ever exposing himself to a counterattack. Pila, the shield-breaking javelin. The pila was not just a javelin, it was a weapon of psychological warfare, designed to cripple enemy defenses before the fight even began. Each Roman legionary carried 2 pila. The moment an enemy formation was close enough, these javelins rained down, creating chaos and confusion. But what made the pila truly devastating was its design. Upon impact, the iron shaft bent, making it impossible for enemies to remove or reuse shields. Pierced by pila became useless dead weight, forcing soldiers to abandon them, leaving them completely exposed. Against a Roman gladius, an unprotected soldier stood no chance. Onagers and ballistae, the engines of destruction. The Romans didn't just rely on hand-to-hand combat. When they laid siege to a city, they didn't wait for surrender. They broke through with brute force. Onagers, powerful catapults that hurled massive boulders, smashing through fortress walls and crushing defenders. Ballistae, giant torsion-powered crossbows that fired heavy bolts with deadly accuracy. These bolts ripped through armor, wood, and flesh alike. With these siege weapons, the Romans could demolish fortifications before ever sending soldiers into battle. With such a devastating arsenal, the Romans dominated battlefields, neutralized enemy formations, and crushed resistance before the first sword was even drawn. But what happened when the enemy refused to fight in the open field? That's when the Romans didn't just fight battles, they turned entire cities into graves. The Romans didn't just attack their enemies, they shattered their spirits. They didn't just win battles, they made sure their enemies never wanted to fight again. Nowhere was this brutal efficiency more evident than at Alesia, 52 BC, where Julius Caesar crushed the last major Gallic resistance. Facing a fortified city and an overwhelming relief army, the Romans did something unthinkable. They turned the battlefield into a prison. Caesar ordered 2 massive walls to be built. The first wall, surrounding Alesia, trapping the defenders inside. The second wall, facing outward, blocking reinforcements from reaching the city. Between these walls, the Romans dug deep trenches, lined them with sharpened spikes, and created a deadly no-man's land. Any warrior foolish enough to charge was cut down before even reaching Roman lines. The Gauls launched desperate assaults, wave after wave of warriors slamming into the Roman fortifications. But every time, they were pushed back. Arrows rained down. Javelins tore through their ranks. Roman cavalry struck from the flanks, turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The Gauls couldn't break the Romans, but the Romans. They were breaking the Gauls. Inside Alesia, starvation set in, food ran out, desperation turned into despair. The defenders waited for rescue, but no help came. Morale crumbled, hope disappeared. The Romans didn't just defeat their enemies, they made them accept defeat before the final blow was even struck. When the Gauls finally surrendered, it wasn't just a victory, it was a message. Rome wasn't just a military force, it was an empire. And it didn't just conquer, it crushed the will to resist. But none of this would have been possible without the most important factor: logistics. How did the Romans sustain long campaigns without breaking? No army, no matter how strong, can survive without supplies. Victory isn't just about strategy or strength, it's about endurance. And no one mastered endurance like the Romans. They built endless roads, ensuring their legions could march farther and faster than any enemy. These roads weren't just pathways, they were lifelines, food weapons, reinforcements. No matter how far they traveled, the legions were never cut off. And every night, no matter where they were, they built fortified camps, not simple tents, fortresses, walls, trenches, watchtowers. They weren't just resting, they were preparing. This wasn't just for shelter. It eliminated the threat of surprise attacks. They weren't just strong. They weren't just skilled, they were a war machine. The Romans didn't just defeat their enemies, they crushed everything in their path. And that's why, for centuries, Rome was the nightmare of every battlefield.